You know, if you jump on a treadmill at the gym, the goal is, it's pretty obvious. You want to get your heart rate up, maybe burn some energy, and then eventually you get off.
Right, you don't just stay on it forever.
Exactly. The walking isn't a destination, it's just a temporary tool. But imagine if society told you that the destination doesn't matter at all. Like, the only thing that makes you a virtuous, valuable human being is keeping your feet moving on that belt.
Even if you're just sweating in place for, 8, 10, maybe 12 hours a day?
Yeah. And if you step off to just sit and breathe for a second, you're suddenly labeled lazy.
Or a burden to society. It's the ultimate hamster wheel. The motion itself becomes the morality, completely divorced from what the motion actually achieves.
That is the perfect way to describe the modern economic treadmill we're all trapped on. And it's actually the central target of today's deep dive. We've curated the specific journey for you listening because, well, we know you love those paradigm-shifting moments.
Those insights that force you to look at your daily routine in a completely new light.
Exactly. So our source material today is this legendary collection of essays titled In Praise of Idleness, or Alaklia Övgü. It was written in the 1930s by Bertrand Russell,
The brilliant philosopher, mathematician, and eventual Nobel laureate.
Right. And Russell looked at the world between the two world wars and realized that humanity was suffering from this intense intolerance, anxiety, and just this bizarre overzealousness for constant action.
Yeah, his overarching thesis is that what we desperately need to save ourselves isn't more grinding labor. It's cool-headed thinking, freedom of the mind, and as shocking as it sounds to our modern ears, a massive increase in idleness.
Which is, that's a tough pill to swallow for anyone raised on the old proverb, the devil finds work for idle hands.
Oh, absolutely. We're basically conditioned from kindergarten to equate busyness with goodness.
We really are. But Russell basically takes a sledgehammer to that idea. He argues that our belief in the inherent virtue of hard work is actually a massive historical scam.
A scam. He calls it a relic of a slave state morality.
Which sounds intense.
It does, but to understand why he says that, you have to look at the mechanics of human history. For thousands of years, agricultural societies operated on a very harsh reality. A peasant had to work from sunrise to sunset just to produce a tiny surplus of food.
Just barely enough to keep themselves alive with a little left over.
Right, but that surplus wasn't kept by the peasant. It was systematically extracted by warriors, priests, and landowners.
And obviously, nobody wants to give up the fruit of their brutal labor voluntarily, so how do you keep the peasants from rebelling?
Well, you can't just use swords forever.
No, that's exhausting and really expensive for the ruling class. So you invent a moral code, you convince the working class that producing the surplus and handing it over is actually a divine duty.
And that right there is the crucial psychological shift. The ruling class has essentially engineered a cult of work. They made it so the peasant felt a sense of moral pride in working themselves to the bone.
While the elites enjoyed the ultimate luxury, which was idleness.
Exactly. And Russell notes that this dynamic has survived all the way into the modern industrial era, just with different labels.
Yeah, he actually divides human economic activity into this very cynical but super accurate hierarchy. First, you have the people altering the position of matter at or near the Earth's surface.
Basically, physical labor.
Right. Physical labor, it's exhausting, it's dangerous, and it is terribly underpaid. Then you have the second group, the people who tell other people to alter matter.
Management.
Management, executives, it's pleasant work, and it's highly paid.
And then we can't forget the third class,
The landowners.
or in today's terms, the massive asset holders.
Yeah.
They don't work at all. They simply charge the first two classes for the privilege of existing and operating on their property.
It's so wild when you lay it out like that, and Russell highlights how deeply ingrained our bias for action is with this hilarious anecdote. It's about a traveler in Naples, long before Mussolini came to power.
Oh, I love this story.
So this traveler is walking down the street and sees 12 beggars lying in the warm Mediterranean sun. He pulls out a single lira coin and announces he will give it to the absolutely laziest beggar of the bunch.
And what happens?
Instantly, 11 of the beggars jump to their feet, shouting and waving their arms, trying to prove how lazy they are.
Which completely defeats the premise.
Exactly. So the traveler quietly hands the coin to the 12th beggar, who was the only one who didn't even bother to roll over.
It's a funny story, but the underlying mechanism is profound. We are so deeply conditioned to jump up and prove our worth through energetic action, even when the situation calls for stillness.
But here's where Russell's logic really starts to challenge our modern reality, because he argues that the Industrial Revolution and modern machinery should have completely shattered this slave state morality.
Right, because we don't live in an era of scarcity anymore.
We don't.
And to illustrate this, Russell uses this great thought experiment about a clothes peg factory, or clothespins, depending on where you're from.
Right, a clothespin factory.
Let's say you have a factory with a certain number of employees working 8-hour shifts. They produce exactly enough clothes pegs to meet the demands of the entire world.
Okay, supply meets demand perfectly.
Then, an engineer invents a new machine that doubles the speed of production. Suddenly, the factory can make the same amount of clothes pegs in half the time.
Logically, if the goal of an economy is to provide for human needs, the solution is super obvious. You just cut everyone's hours to 4 hours a day.
That would be the rational thing to do.
The world still gets all the clothes pegs it needs, the workers keep their pay because the revenue is the exact same, and suddenly an entire workforce gets 4 hours of their life back every single day to just, exist.
But look at what actually happens in our system. Instead of distributing the leisure, the factory owner keeps half the workforce on the grueling 8-hour schedule and just fires the other half.
Just so frustrating to think about.
The owner maximizes profit, but creates mass unemployment. The remaining workers are terrified of losing their jobs, so they accept stagnant wages. And the fired workers lose their livelihood, which leads to bankruptcies and societal misery.
When I read that, I immediately thought about the panic we're seeing today with artificial intelligence and automation.
Oh, it's the exact same debate.
It is. We keep having these debates where people are terrified that software is going to take their jobs. But if you step back, it's absurd. If a machine can do half our work, why does that feel like a threat instead of a liberation?
Because we refuse to let go of the 8-hour workday.
Exactly. We artificially maintain the struggle.
And Russell argues that if we actually embraced a 4-hour workday, the ripple effects would transform human psychology. The average person would finally have the biological energy to cultivate what he calls good nature.
Good nature.
Yeah. When people are exhausted and terrified of losing their jobs, they become bitter, competitive, and cruel. Good nature, kindness, patience, empathy is the product of ease and security, not a life of grinding labor.
But, okay, let me jump in here. If you suddenly give millions of people 4 extra hours of free time every day, how are they supposed to spend it? Won't people just get bored or fall into destructive habits?
That's the million-dollar question, and it leads us right into Russell's incredibly passionate defense of what he calls useless knowledge.
Useless knowledge.
Yes, we live in a society deeply infected by Francis Bacon's famous maxim that knowledge is power.
We hear that all the time.
Right. We've internalized the idea that learning is only valuable if it has a utilitarian purpose, like if it helps you build a bridge, cure a disease, or generate quarterly profit.
If it doesn't alter matter, we consider it a waste of time.
But Russell completely rejects that. He believes that knowledge pursued purely for joy, curiosity, or quiet contemplation is the very thing that makes human life worth living.
He shares this wonderful historical story about the philosopher Thomas Hobbes. So Hobbes was in his 40s, just wandering through a gentleman's library, when he happened to spot a book of Euclid's geometry lying open.
Specifically, it was open to the Pythagorean theorem.
Yes. And Hobbes reads the theorem, and he literally shouts out loud, "By God, this is impossible!"
He was completely blown away.
He is so absolutely captivated that he reads the entire mathematical proof backwards, tracing every logical step all the way back to the foundational axioms until he finally understands it.
And he wasn't trying to figure out how to survey a plot of land or build a better catapult for the military.
No, he was just experiencing the pure, intoxicating joy of intellectual discovery.
That kind of intellectual play is what Russell wants us to cultivate. It's about enriching our internal lives. He gives another beautiful, seemingly trivial example about the history of the apricot.
Oh, I loved this detail. Knowing the history of the apricot is not going to make you a better farmer, and it certainly won't help you pay your taxes.
Definitely not.
But Russell points out that the apricot originated in China during the Han Dynasty. It was eventually carried to India by Chinese hostages, captured by King Kanishka.
Quite the journey.
And from there, it traveled to Persia, and eventually made its way into the Roman Empire. And because it ripens so early in the season, the word apricot shares the exact same Latin root as the word precocious.
It's just a neat fact. But when you hold that fruit in your hand and know its journey across empires and centuries, Eating it becomes a richer experience.
Yeah, you aren't just consuming calories.
You're connecting with the sweeping tapestry of human civilization.
I get the poetry of that, I really do. But let me play devil's advocate for a second. If you're listening to this on your commute, you might be thinking, look, I don't have the luxury of contemplating ancient fruit. I have a mortgage, I have a boss who emails me at 9 p.m., I have real world stress.
Sure, that's totally fair.
Doesn't pursuing completely random, useless facts just act as like an escapist distraction from solving our actual problems?
That is the natural modern reflex. But Russell counters it by explaining the deep psychological mechanics of useless knowledge. It isn't an escape, it's a shield.
A shield.
Yeah. Learning things outside of your immediate survival builds a habit of deep thinking. It forcibly zooms out your perspective.
Okay, give me an example of how that works in practice.
Russell points to historical knowledge. When you are furious about the greed of modern politicians or corporate capitalists, your anxiety spikes because it feels like the world is uniquely terrible right now.
It always feels like we're in the worst timeline.
Right. But Russell suggests looking back at Brutus, the famous Roman figure, who is historically idolized as the noble defender of the Republic.
Et tu, Brute.
Exactly, that guy. It turns out Brutus was essentially an ancient loan shark.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He loaned money to a city in Cyprus at an extortionate 40% interest rate.
40%.
And when the city couldn't pay him back, he hired a private army to besiege them until they coughed up the cash.
So the great hero of the Republic was starving a city to collect on a payday loan.
Precisely. And understanding that doesn't fix your mortgage rate today. But psychologically, it shrinks your immediate anxieties.
Because it shows things have always been kind of messed up.
Exactly. It breaks the illusion of a perfect past and reminds you that human nature has always been deeply flawed. This historical perspective brings a profound sense of calm.
I see.
It prevents you from falling into the rigid, fanatical mindset that leads people to demand extreme, cruel solutions to modern problems.
Useless knowledge gives you emotional shock absorbers. I love that. But if we are going to embrace this 4-hour workday and cultivate this deep, contemplative thinking, we run into a major physical roadblock.
We do.
Russell argues that we quite literally do not have the space for it. The very architecture of our homes actively prevents us from being free, and this is especially true if you are a woman.
He takes a hard look at the legacy of 19th century architecture. During the Industrial Revolution, society built massive, hyper-efficient collective spaces for work factories.
Right.
But for living, we built endless rows of isolated, hyper-individualistic tiny houses.
The blueprint for the modern suburbs. And if you are listening to this while folding a mountain of laundry after working a full 8-hour shift, Russell's diagnosis is going to hit you right in the chest.
Oh, for sure.
Because he argues that these small private homes operate as engines of unpaid domestic slavery.
Think about the mechanics of a single-family home. Every single house requires its own kitchen, its own cleaning routine, its own child-rearing system.
It's incredibly redundant.
And historically, and still largely today, that immense burden of isolated, repetitive labor falls squarely on the woman. She is trapped in this tiny kingdom, burning all her potential energy just to maintain the physical structure and the family unit.
Russell's solution to this is incredibly radical for the 1930s. He proposes tearing down these inefficient rows of individual houses and replacing them with magnificent communal blocks.
Picture high-rise buildings built around central, sunlit courtyards.
Yeah, instead of 50 individual women cooking 50 separate dinners in 50 tiny kitchens, you have one massive communal kitchen run by paid professionals. You have grand dining halls.
And most importantly, you have safe, well-equipped nurseries.
Where children are raised and socialized by trained early childhood educators during the day.
Now I can practically hear the friction through the speaker.
Oh, absolutely. The immediate reaction most of us have is absolutely not. My home is my castle. I want the privacy of my own space. I don't want to eat in a dining hall with my neighbors.
Right.
Isn't communal living asking people to surrender a fundamental human need for a private sanctuary?
Russell deeply analyzes that exact psychological resistance. He argues that our intense craving for strict privacy isn't some biological absolute. It is largely a manufactured desire driven by an outdated obsession with private property and fundamentally patriarchal dominance.
How does the "my home is my castle" idea connect to the patriarchy?
Because historically, the husband enjoyed the feeling of being the absolute ruler of that tiny castle. It was a space where his wife was economically dependent on him, and her entire day was structured around working for his comfort.
So the isolation wasn't a bug, it was a feature of control. That is a brutal mirror to hold up to society.
It is. But Russell asks us to look at the immense freedom on the other side of that discomfort. He compares his communal architectural vision to the beautiful, serene colleges of Oxford or historical monasteries.
Okay.
If we communalized the daily grind of survival, women would be completely free to work outside the home if they chose. They would have the exact same distinct leisure hours as men.
Think about the mental real estate that would open up. If you didn't have to spend 3 hours every evening cooking, doing dishes, and prepping lunches for the next day, the time you actually spend with your children wouldn't be exhausted, irritable time.
It would be relaxed, quality time.
You'd actually get to be a human being rather than a domestic administrator.
But if communal living in a 4-hour workday makes so much logical and emotional sense, we have to ask the ultimate question, why haven't we done it? Why do we fiercely defend the systems that keep us exhausted?
And this brings us to the core of Russell's economic critique. It's what he calls the Midas myth and the absolute madness of producer psychology.
We are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of what trade and wealth actually are. We equate money with wealth, just like King Midas did, forgetting that you cannot eat gold.
The example Russell uses regarding post-World War I German reparations perfectly illustrates this cognitive dissonance.
It really does.
So, after the First World War, the victorious Allies demanded massive financial reparations from Germany to pay for the damage. But Germany's economy was wrecked. They didn't have anywhere near enough gold to pay the debt.
Right.
The only physical way they could settle the score was by manufacturing goods like coal and iron and giving them to the Allies.
But here is where the madness kicks in. The Allies absolutely refused.
They immediately threw up massive trade tariffs against Germany.
Why? Because they didn't want free German coal and iron flooding their markets and competing with their own domestic mining and steel industries.
It is genuinely hilarious in a dark way. The Allies are demanding to be paid, but they actively block the only form of payment that exists, because receiving free stuff would threaten their own citizens' right to work hard in the coal mines.
Russell uses a brilliant analogy to show how backwards this is. Imagine Robinson Crusoe alone on his island. Let's say he somehow forces the Germans to pay him reparations.
Okay.
If a ship showed up and started unloading free clothes, free food, and free building supplies, Crusoe wouldn't complain. He would sit back under a palm tree, relax, and enjoy his newfound free time.
He wouldn't yell, "Stop giving me free clothes, you are destroying my local hide tanning industry."
Exactly. A sane person views goods as the goal. But entire nations act like a lunatic Robinson Crusoe.
Yeah.
They fight desperately to keep the free goods out, just so they can keep grinding away.
And Russell explains the mechanism behind this. He calls it producer psychology. Somewhere along the line of industrialization, we evolved to prefer the power and triumph of selling over the pleasure of consuming.
We view foreign nations solely as competitors trying to steal our jobs, rather than as customers or collaborators.
And this mindset guarantees a constant state of economic warfare, tariffs, and just a vicious cycle of universal bankruptcies.
He also takes a massive swing at the gold standard, which was still a major debate in his time. He exposes it as a primitive superstition.
Yeah, he points out the absurdity of spending massive amounts of human labor to dig gold out of a dark, deep hole in South Africa, only to load it onto a ship, transport it across the ocean, and lock it away in another dark, deep hole in a bank vault in London or New York.
The gold literally does nothing to improve human life. It's just an agreed-upon hallucination.
Right. Russell argues that true stability can't come from hoarding shiny rocks. It requires intelligent, coordinated global banking and a recognition of shared human needs.
But when nations refuse to coordinate and instead hoard resources and protect their producer psychology, the system eventually breaks down. You get massive economic crashes.
And when economic hoarding creates widespread unemployment and poverty, people get deeply desperate.
They do.
And desperate people stop asking for moderate, rational solutions. They start looking for saviors. And that cause and effect transition is exactly how the totalitarian extremes of the 1930s found their foothold.
Now, as we look at how Russell diagnosed the political landscape of the 1930s, we're going to be discussing his critiques of both fascism and communism.
And just to be completely clear for you listening, we aren't taking political sides here.
No, nor are we endorsing his specific worldview.
We are simply acting as a mirror to reflect the philosophical arguments Russell laid out in the original text, to understand how a thinker in that era processed the chaos around him.
With that context in mind, Russell saw the world being pushed toward a binary choice between two extreme ideologies, and he forcefully rejected both of them.
He believed both fascism and communism shared a fatal flaw. They stopped treating human beings as ends in themselves and started treating them as raw material to be hammered into a predetermined ideological shape.
Let's unpack his critique of fascism first. Russell traces its roots back to a rejection of reason. He points to philosophers like Fichte, who promoted this deeply irrational concept of the ego.
The ego.
Essentially, Fichte argued that a nation's collective will, its ego, is the ultimate truth, and it can override objective reality. If the nation wills something to be true, it is true, facts be damned.
Wow. He also points to Thomas Carlyle, who worshipped brutal, militaristic heroes and openly despised the common masses.
And Nietzsche, who idealized the Superman while viewing the vast majority of humanity as nothing more than expendable tools to serve the elite.
Russell explains the mechanics of how fascism takes hold. It appeals to industrialists who want untrammeled power without democratic checks, and it preys on the middle class who feel economically terrified and left behind.
By abandoning objective truth in favor of mass hysteria and myth-making, fascism fundamentally rejects the inherent dignity of the individual.
Then, Russell turns his analytical lens onto communism. And while he is sympathetic to the ultimate utopian goal of a classless society, he completely dismantles the methods and the underlying philosophy used to get there.
Right. For starters, he fundamentally disagrees with Marx's labor theory of value.
Let's explain that theory real quick.
Sure. Marx argued that the economic value of a good is determined almost entirely by the amount of manual labor required to produce it.
But Russell thought this was dangerously short-sighted.
He did, because it completely ignores the value of the intellectual labor, the inventor, the planner, or the engineer whose thinking made the manual labor easier in the first place.
By glorifying manual labor over intellectual work, Russell warns that communism alienates the very thinkers and scientists needed to actually build a better society.
Furthermore, he heavily criticizes the concept of a dictatorship of the proletariat.
The mechanism of power is the big issue here. Russell argues that any dictatorship, even one claiming to act solely on behalf of the working class, will inevitably rot into a bureaucratic oligarchy.
The small group of people who hold the ultimate power will inevitably use police-state tactics to maintain that power, crushing freedom of thought and inquiry in the process.
Reading his critique of both these extremes, the analogy that came to my mind was watching a gardener try to force a complex living oak tree into the shape of a combustion engine.
Oh, that's a great way to visualize it. You can hack at the branches, you can bend the trunk, you can tie it down with steel wires.
Exactly. But because it's a living human society and not raw metal, the end result isn't a perfectly functioning machine. Eventually, the branches snap.
You just end up with a deformed, traumatized tree.
You cannot force human nature into an artificial ideological box without inflicting immense cruelty.
So, if fascism and communism are the two monsters from the Odyssey, the Scylla, and Charybdis that will destroy the ship of state if you get too close to either, how does Russell suggest we navigate through?
His solution is democratic socialism.
And he is incredibly specific that the democratic part is just as vital as the socialist part.
Absolutely. He argues that major economic power, things like land ownership, banking, and international trade, should be managed by the state to prevent the chaotic hoarding of the Midas economy.
But the political power to direct that state must remain strictly, aggressively democratic.
And the most crucial mechanic of his solution is the method of transition. He argues it must be achieved through peaceful, rational persuasion, not through violent class war or revolution.
Because if you use terror and violence to build your new world, the violence breeds ruthless, paranoid leaders who will immediately abandon the original utopian goals just to maintain their grip on power.
The means you use will always dictate the ends you achieve.
It is a profound, sweeping vision of what human society could actually be if we just stepped off the treadmill and stopped glorifying unnecessary struggle.
It really is. So let's synthesize the journey Bertrand Russell has taken us on today. We started by realizing that our deep-seated guilt about resting is just leftover programming from a slave state morality.
We explored how modern technology should have already given us a 4-hour workday, freeing up our energy to pursue the profound joy and resilience found in useless knowledge.
We examined how redesigning the physical architecture of our cities into communal spaces could shatter the isolating burden of domestic labor, providing true freedom for women.
We exposed the absurdity of the Midas economy, where nations refuse free wealth because they are blinded by producer psychology.
And finally, we saw why we must fiercely protect freedom of thought and reject authoritarian extremes that try to hammer living societies into rigid, unforgiving molds.
The entire deep dive really challenges the core metrics we use to measure a successful life.
Which brings me right back to that image we started with, the treadmill humming away at the gym, burning energy just to stay in one place.
Yeah.
Russell wrote these essays nearly a century ago. Yet today, in an era of unbelievable technological abundance, we still tie our fundamental human worth to how many hours we grind, how much we produce, and how exhausted we look while doing it.
It's something we really need to rethink.
So here's a final thought for you to mull over as you step back into your daily routine. What if the ultimate mark of a highly advanced, civilized society isn't measured by how efficiently it produces goods, but by how gracefully its people have learned to be idle?